At the time, I was in my final semester of nursing school. It was that point where everyone was a little tired, counting down the days until graduation, but still full of curiosity about what came next. My group of friends was inseparable. Anna, who was super skeptical about everything. Ryan, the class clown, and Claire, who had a special knack for telling scary stories and making everyone jump. It was Claire who came up with the idea to visit St. Clement's Hospital, an abandoned building that everyone said was full of bizarre stories. The excuse was to study old hospital architecture. But the truth was, we just wanted to have fun and maybe get a little thrill from exploring the unknown. St. Clement's was located in a remote part of the city, half consumed by overgrown vegetation, and it had been shut down for decades. The last time anyone had mentioned it was during a lecture on epidemics, since it had been used as an isolation hospital in the 1940s. They said many people had died there, and of course that fueled urban legends. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea of going, but Ryan assured us it would just be a quick visit. We packed our backpacks, grabbed flashlights, and drove out in the late afternoon because no one wanted to be there at night. But as soon as we arrived and started exploring, I realized there was something strange about the place. It wasn't just the smell of mold or the oppressive silence, but small details that didn't make sense. A half-empty soda can on the reception desk, a plate with leftover food in one of the rooms, and most unsettling of all, fresh footprints in the dusty floor. At first, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe a homeless person was using the building for shelter. It wasn't uncommon. After all, St. Clement's was large, with multiple hallways and rooms that still seemed relatively intact. Claire even joked, "Hey, if we find a ghost doctor here, we should ask for a free diagnosis." Everyone laughed, but my stomach churned. That uncomfortable feeling that something was out of place wouldn't leave me. Still, we kept going. Ryan led the way, his flashlight illuminating the rusty signs on the doors: operating room, ICU, laboratory. We were caught in a mix of fascination and unease. The late afternoon light filtered through some broken windows, casting odd shadows that seemed to shift as we walked. It was in the main hallway that everything started to change. While Claire was taking pictures with her phone, Anna noticed something hanging on the wall: a white lab coat. It didn't look old. In fact, it was clean and folded as if someone had left it there on purpose. Ryan stepped closer to take a look and noticed an ID badge clipped to the collar. "Dr. Ernest Diaz, general practitioner," he read aloud. Everyone froze for a few seconds, trying to process that. Then we heard footsteps. Footsteps coming from the end of the hallway, slow and deliberate, echoing as if someone was wearing hard-soled shoes. We instantly turned off our flashlights and pressed ourselves against the wall, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind or an animal. But it wasn't. The footsteps got closer, and then we saw him. A man appeared at the end of the hallway, wearing what looked like medical clothes, but they weren't ordinary. His pants were wrinkled, his shirt slightly yellowed, and he wore a surgical apron that looked like it belonged in an old movie. His face was partially obscured by a mask, but you could see his deep-set eyes and stern expression. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a firm but eerily calm voice. Claire, who usually never lost her cool, muttered a weak, "Sorry." Ryan tried to explain that we were students and just wanted to see the place. The man stared at us in silence for what felt like an eternity, then smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was wrong, almost mocking. "Oh, students, of course. Well, St. Clement's always needs curious young minds," he said, his tone dripping with irony. After that, he turned and began walking slowly, gesturing for us to follow. I wanted to run, I swear, but there was something about the way he looked over his shoulder that froze me in place. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fear of drawing too much attention by running. We followed him down several hallways until we reached a room that looked like an old infirmary. He unlocked the door with a key from his pocket, stepped inside, and said, "Feel free to look around. Just don't leave without letting me know." Then he locked the door from the outside. That's when the panic began to spread among us. Claire was the first to run to the door and try the handle, but it was no use. "He locked us in here," she yelled, her voice shaking. Ryan tried to stay calm, saying the man was probably joking or would be back soon. Anna, on the other hand, was already examining the room, trying to find another way out. The infirmary was cramped, with rusty iron beds pushed against the walls, tattered curtains hanging from rods, and a strange, almost sweet smell that churned my stomach. The sunlight barely filtered through the frosted windows, and the only light came from Ryan's trembling flashlight. "This isn't normal," I muttered, feeling a lump in my throat. While we debated what to do, Claire pointed to a table in the corner of the room. On it was a tray of medical instruments. The problem? The instruments were clean, as if they'd been used recently and then put away. There was also a sort of journal lying open, its pages filled with hurried, almost illegible handwriting. Anna picked it up and started flipping through, reading aloud. Most of it was incomprehensible, but a few words jumped out. Procedure. Volunteers. Reversal. At the end of the last written page, there was something that made all our blood run cold. They always come back. Always. That's when we heard footsteps again, but this time they weren't slow. They were quick, almost running, heading straight for the door. The footsteps stopped abruptly on the other side, followed by the sound of keys jingling. We froze in complete silence, exchanging desperate looks. Claire gripped my hand so tightly my fingers ached. The handle turned slowly, but the door didn't open. Instead, we heard the man's voice again, lower and darker. "You shouldn't have touched anything. That complicates things." My heart raced. He knew we'd touched the journal. "What do you want? Let us out," Ryan shouted, but the only response was a low, almost whispered laugh, followed by footsteps retreating again. We stood there, paralyzed, unsure if it was safe to move. Anna, ever practical, started looking for another way out. She noticed one of the windows was cracked, but covered with iron bars. "If we can break the glass, maybe we can get someone's attention outside," she suggested, while Ryan searched for something heavy to use as a tool. Meanwhile, Claire kept flipping through the journal, trying to make sense of it. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a sketch of a hospital map with hand-drawn markings. One of the rooms was circled in red, labeled Final Procedures. Before we could process what that meant, Ryan's flashlight began flickering. Then, suddenly, it went out completely, plunging the room into stifling darkness. For a few moments, no one spoke. The darkness felt like it was swallowing everything around us, and the silence was so intense I could hear my own rapid breathing. Ryan shook the flashlight, trying to get it to work again, but with no luck. "This isn't happening. This isn't happening," Claire whispered, almost like she was trying to convince herself it was all a nightmare. Then we heard it. A slow scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Anna immediately pointed her phone's weak light toward the corner of the room, but there was nothing there. Nothing that could explain the sound, at least. "There's someone here with us," Ryan whispered, his voice filled with a fear I'd never heard before. The scraping continued, now moving along the walls as if something was circling us, always just out of sight. Finally, Anna gathered her courage and approached the window, trying to smash the glass with one of the rusted chairs. Each blow echoed loudly, almost like a scream in the silence. The noise was enough to make whatever was outside stop moving. The silence returned, but it was worse than the sound. We could all feel we were being watched, but we didn't know from where. Then we heard his voice again, this time coming from a rusty speaker in the corner of the room. "You don't understand, do you? This is necessary. All of this is for the greater good." The metallic tone of his voice reverberated through the room, and it was the final straw for Claire, who began to cry. I knew we had to get out of there. Fast. Anna finally managed to break the glass, but the iron bars were still in the way. Ryan and I tried together to push them, but they were firmly embedded in the wall. Meanwhile, Claire was trembling in the corner, clutching the journal as if it could protect her. "He's messing with us," she murmured. "He's not just some lunatic, he knows exactly what he's doing." Before we could respond, a loud banging on the door froze us in place. It sounded like he was trying to force his way in, but not in a hurry. The knocks were slow, rhythmic, each louder than the last. Ryan turned toward the door, gripping a chair like a weapon. "If he comes in, I'll hit him," he said, his voice trembling but determined. Anna's phone light started to flicker, and that was enough for Clara to finally explode. "We need to get out now," she pointed to the map in the journal, which showed another exit through a back room. If the map is right, we can reach a fire escape. We decided to try, even though we weren't sure we could trust those scribbles. We gathered all the courage we had left and pushed the infirmary door open, bracing ourselves to face the man, but the hallway was empty. Dark, cold, and silent, but empty. Following the map, we moved quickly, trying to stay quiet. But then, in the middle of the hallway, we saw a shadow dart across in front of us, so close we could hear the sound of its breathing. That's when Claire started screaming. Ryan clamped a hand over Claire's mouth, trying to stifle the scream. "If he hears us, we're screwed," he hissed, wide-eyed. Anna shone her phone's light toward the end of the hallway, but there was nothing there. Still, the air felt heavier, almost impossible to breathe. We kept moving, now practically running, guided by the map and the hope that the fire escape would lead us out. Every door along the way seemed strategically locked, heightening the sense that we were being led like rats in a maze. Turning a corner, we finally came to a red door, just like the one on the map. It was unlocked. Claire hesitated for a second, but Ryan pulled her inside. "Don't think, just move," he said. The room looked like an old operating theater. The smell of chemicals was strong, and there was a gurney in the center with worn leather straps hanging from its sides. Medical instruments were arranged on trays, but they weren't like anything we'd seen before. They looked archaic, almost medieval, and many were stained with what looked like dried blood. Before we could react, the door behind us slammed shut. "I knew you'd make it here." His voice echoed, but this time it wasn't coming from a speaker. He was in the room with us, standing in the corner, watching us as if he had been waiting for this moment all night. "You don't understand, but you're about to make history," he said, spinning a syringe in his hand. The smile he gave made the ground feel like it was disappearing beneath our feet. Panic was immediate. Ryan charged at the man with the chair he was still holding, but the man moved with terrifying speed, dodging effortlessly. Before Ryan could try again, the man raised the syringe and plunged it into his neck with precision. Ryan collapsed to the floor, convulsing for a few seconds before going completely still. "The human body is fascinating," the man murmured, almost as if he were talking to himself, as he studied Ryan like he was a science experiment. Claire screamed again, but this time Anna took the lead. She grabbed one of the trays of instruments and hurled it at the man, hitting him in the arm. He staggered for a moment, just long enough for Anna to drag Ryan away, even though he remained unconscious. I took advantage of the distraction to run to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The man turned his gaze to me, cold and intense, and started walking toward me, muttering about necessary sacrifices and advancing science. That's when Anna found something that looked like a scalpel and held it in both hands, pointing it at him. "Enough. Stay away from us." For the first time, he hesitated. Not out of fear, but as if calculating his next move. Before he could react, Claire found a piece of metal on the floor and started pounding on the door's lock with all her strength. The noise echoed through the room, and finally, the lock gave way. "Go," I shouted, pulling Ryan along with Anna. We bolted, leaving the man standing in the center of the room, watching us with that sinister smile. We ran down the hallway like our lives depended on it. And honestly, they did. Ryan was still limp, barely able to support himself, but we didn't stop. Claire led the way, guided by the shaky light of the phone, while Anna and I dragged Ryan. We reached what looked like the emergency exit, a rusty door with a faded sign. We pushed with all our strength, and it finally creaked open. Outside, night had already fallen, and the fresh air felt like a relief, but the sensation of being watched still clung to us. We didn't stop until we got to the car. We threw Ryan into the back seat. Claire took the driver's seat despite not being the best driver, and we sped away, tires screeching. No one said a word until we were miles from the hospital. It was only then that I realized I still had the journal with me. When I opened it, I noticed something written on a page that had previously been blank. "You left, but you didn't escape." The terror hit me all over again, and I immediately slammed the journal shut, as if ignoring it would make it go away. Since that day, none of us have spoken about St. Clement's. Ryan recovered, but he could never explain what the man had injected into him. As for the journal, it's still tucked away at the back of my closet, and every time I see it, I think about burning it. But something stops me, as if it's waiting for me to open it again. It was 1 a.m., and I was in the underground parking lot of a hospital, waiting for my friend. He had come to pick up some last-minute test results, and I had offered to give him a ride because he seemed worried. I've always been a bit anxious, so while I waited in my car, I kept checking my phone, fiddling with the radio, anything to pass the time. The parking lot was huge but nearly empty. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, dimly, and the sound of my fingers tapping on the steering wheel echoed in the silence. That's when I noticed another car. It was parked a few spots away from me, its engine running, but there didn't seem to be anyone inside. At first I thought the driver was just waiting for someone, like I was. But after a few minutes, I saw the car door open, and a man stepped out. He was tall, thin, wearing a cap that obscured part of his face, and he walked slowly, like he was surveying the area. I felt a chill when he looked directly at me. His gaze was cold and calculating, as if he already knew everything about me. He started walking toward my car, and my gut told me something wasn't right. I cracked the window just slightly as he got closer, trying to keep a safe distance. "Nice car," he said, his voice low and drawn out. "How many horses does it have?" It was a simple question, but the way he said it felt off, like he had rehearsed those words. I tried to respond casually, but my voice came out shaky. "Oh, around 150, I think," I said, my eyes discreetly darting to the car key on the dashboard. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was tense, artificial, like he was testing my reaction. "Interesting," he said, tilting his head. "You know, a lot of people don't know how to take care of a car like this. I bet you take really good care of it." Every word he said made me feel more uneasy, like he was forcing a conversation that didn't make sense. When he took a step closer, I leaned back into my seat, making sure the doors were locked. "Are you waiting for someone?" he asked, and that question sent a chill down my spine. Why did he want to know? My mind started racing, trying to come up with an answer. "Yeah, just a friend. He's coming down any minute," I lied, hoping that would make him go away. Instead, he stepped even closer, his hands now in the pockets of his jacket. "Interesting," he repeated, almost robotically, like he was stalling for time. His car engine was still running, its low hum reverberating through the empty parking lot. "Well, I don't want to bother you," he said finally, but instead of leaving, he stood next to my car door, blocking my view to the right. That's when I realized he wasn't going anywhere. My hand was already on the steering wheel, ready to turn the key and get out of there as fast as possible. But he was too close to the door, and I knew that if I made any sudden moves, he might react unpredictably. "So what time is your friend coming out?" he asked, leaning in slightly as if trying to peer into my car. A metallic, nauseating smell wafted in with him, and I swallowed hard to keep my composure. "Any minute now," I lied again, trying to sound calm. He stared at me, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then he smiled again, but this time, there was something in his smile that made my stomach churn. He took a step back, but instead of walking away, he positioned himself between my car and his. I glanced in my rearview mirror and noticed something strange. The back of his car was low, as if the trunk was weighed down. A series of terrifying thoughts raced through my mind, but I tried not to panic. "You don't want to step out and take a look at the engine with me?" he asked, his tone almost commanding. My gut screamed at me not to leave the car. "The engine's fine, thanks," I replied, forcing a faint smile. He tilted his head again, as if studying my reaction. Then he made the next move that confirmed I was in real danger. He reached into his pocket and began to pull something out. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I tried to keep my eyes on him without showing the panic that was consuming me. When he finally pulled his hand out, he was holding what looked like a screwdriver, but the way he twirled it in his hand was threatening. "You know," he said, in that eerily calm, calculated tone, "these older cars often have issues with the door locks. Maybe you need a little help fixing it." He lightly tapped the screwdriver against my window, each tap echoing in the stillness of the parking lot. My instincts screamed louder than ever. "Get out of here, now." Without thinking, I started the engine. He stepped forward, blocking my path, but I didn't wait to see what he would do. I threw the car into reverse, jerking the wheel to swerve around him. The car jolted as I maneuvered, and I heard the sound of metal scraping against my rear bumper. He had tried to hit the car with the screwdriver. I didn't look back. I just sped toward the exit ramp, my heart racing and my hands trembling on the wheel. My biggest fear was that he'd jump into his car and come after me. When I finally reached the street level, I breathed a sigh of relief to see he wasn't following me, at least, not yet. I drove out of the parking lot without looking back. But the tension stayed with me, like he could appear at any moment. I went straight to the main entrance of the hospital and parked right in front, where it was well lit and there were people around. I called my friend, my voice shaking, and told him to come down as quickly as possible. When he finally arrived, I explained what had happened, trying to sound less scared than I actually was. He immediately suggested we go to hospital security, but honestly, I just wanted to leave. Something about that man, the entire situation, felt bigger than any logical explanation. On the drive home, my friend tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just some random creep. But I knew it wasn't that simple. The way he acted, the strange questions, the screwdriver, it all felt calculated, like he'd done this before. And the detail that haunted me most, his car was still running when I left. Like he was waiting for someone else. I don't know who he was or what he really wanted, but I've never returned to an empty parking lot at night. Even now, whenever I'm alone in a deserted place, I remember his eyes and wonder what would have happened if I had hesitated for just one more second. At first, it seemed like just another ordinary shift in the emergency room. I was in my first year as a medical resident, and nights in the ER were always unpredictable. I was used to seeing all kinds of patients. Those worried about every little symptom, the frequent flyers complaining about the same issues, and of course, the ones who truly needed urgent care. It was during one of those nights that I met Mark, a man in his mid-30s, with neatly cut hair and simple but tidy clothes. He had come in complaining about shoulder pain. I examined him, ran a few basic tests, and quickly determined it wasn't anything serious. He thanked me, called me an excellent doctor, and left. So far, so normal. The strangeness began when he returned 2 days later. This time, he complained about a persistent headache. We ran new tests, and once again, everything came back normal. But what caught my attention was his insistence on being seen specifically by me. He asked for me by name at the front desk, waited until I was available, and seemed satisfied just to have a conversation. "It's rare to find someone so attentive these days," he said while I tried to explain that his results didn't indicate anything concerning. Over the next few weeks, he began showing up frequently, each time with a different complaint, but always insisting that he wanted me to treat him. I started feeling uneasy, but tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence. His visits grew stranger over time. It wasn't just the fact that he came in every week, it was the way he stretched out his appointments, always trying to steer the conversation toward personal topics. "Do you live near the hospital, doctor?" he asked once as I filled out his chart. I dodged the question, giving a vague response, but he kept pressing, trying to establish a connection that didn't make sense in a professional setting. After a few minutes, he'd flash an awkward smile and say something like, "You really have a gift, doctor. I feel better just talking to you." Things escalated when he started leaving notes at the front desk. At first, they were simple messages thanking me for my care and praising my work. But soon the notes became more personal. "You're different, doctor. It feels like you understand people in a way no one else does." Or, "I know you're always busy, but I hope you realize how special you are." I spoke to the receptionist about it, and she told me he always waited until she handed the note to me directly, as if he needed to be sure I'd read it. I started feeling restless. He wasn't just a patient anymore. He seemed obsessed. The nights in the hospital grew longer, and I felt constantly watched. Every time I worked a shift, I had this gnawing feeling that he might show up. And as if he could read my mind, he did. Now, in addition to his appointments, he found excuses to linger in the waiting room or the hallway near my office, asking other staff if I was available. One time he brought me coffee and left it on my desk with a note, "To help you get through the night, you deserve it." I thanked him but didn't touch the coffee. By now, this had crossed every professional boundary and entered a territory that made me feel exposed. The breaking point came on a Friday night. My shift was over, and I was exhausted. As I walked to the parking garage, my mind was preoccupied with thoughts of getting home and collapsing into bed. But as I approached my car, I saw someone leaning against it. It was Mark. He stood there, hands in his pockets, watching me. For a moment, I froze. The only thing I managed to say was, "What are you doing here?" He smiled but didn't answer, just kept staring at me like he was waiting for something. The parking garage was empty, and the silence was deafening. The distance between us felt both too close and impossibly far, leaving me completely isolated. I took a deep breath, trying not to show how uncomfortable I felt. "Look, Mark, it's not appropriate for you to be here. If you need help, it's better to schedule an appointment during normal hours." I tried to sound firm, but my voice came out weaker than I'd hoped. He tilted his head slightly, the smile still on his face. "I just wanted to talk to you, Doctor. You're the only one who really listens to me." His words sent a chill down my spine. His tone was calm, almost gentle, but there was something deeply unsettling about his persistence. I stepped back, trying to maintain some distance, and he noticed. "Are you scared of me?" he asked, the smile fading slowly. My mind raced, searching for a way out. The parking garage was dimly lit, and the exit felt miles away. "It's not that, Mark. I just think we need to respect boundaries, you know? It's for your own good too." I tried to keep a professional tone, but he stepped closer, cutting off my path to the car. "Boundaries? But we have something special, Doctor. You understand me, don't you?" My heart pounded. It wasn't just discomfort anymore. It was genuine fear. My palms started to sweat, but I forced myself to sound authoritative. "Mark, if you don't leave now, I'm going to call security." He stopped, his expression shifting to a mix of frustration and anger. Then, almost in a whisper, he said, "You don't know what you're missing." Those words made the air feel heavier. Without warning, he stepped even closer, so close I could smell his cologne, overpowering and nauseating. My heart was racing, but I held my ground. "Mark, I'm serious. Go back to the reception desk or go home." "This has gone too far," I said, my voice as steady as I could make it. He stared into my eyes, and for the first time, the smile vanished completely. "You don't get it, Doctor. I just want to help. You work so hard, take care of so many people, but no one takes care of you." A shiver ran down my spine. It was as if he truly believed we had some sort of connection. Before I could respond, I heard hurried footsteps echoing through the garage. I turned and saw one of the hospital's security guards approaching us. He must have been doing his rounds and noticed something off. "Everything okay here, Doctor?" the guard asked, stopping beside me. Before I could answer, Mark was already backing away, raising his hands as if to say he'd done nothing wrong. "I was just saying goodbye," he said, his tone calm, but his unsettling gaze still fixed on me. He took a few more steps back, got into his car, and drove off, his engine roaring as he sped out of the garage. Even with the guard beside me, I stood frozen for a few moments, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I went straight home, but the weight of the incident stayed with me like a shadow. I locked every door and window, a precaution I'd never felt the need to take before, and slept with my phone by my side, ready to call the police at the slightest noise. The following days were quieter, but I remained on edge, constantly watching the ER doors and scanning the parking lot, dreading the possibility of seeing him again. But he didn't come back. As much as I felt relieved, there was something that wouldn't let me relax. The feeling that it wasn't over. A few weeks later, I received his final message. An envelope appeared at the reception desk, addressed directly to me. Inside was a single photograph, my car, parked in my home garage, taken from an angle that made it clear he had been there. On the back of the photo, a single handwritten sentence. "Taking care of you was all I ever wanted." I handed the photo over to the hospital administration, who involved the police, but I never heard from him again. Even so, the paranoia stayed. To this day, years later, I can't park in empty lots or walk alone at night without feeling like I'm being watched. Maybe he's gone, but the sense that someone is always nearby has never left me.